If you can apply the word genius to crime, Lucky Luciano was a genius.
Lucky Luciano. What was his power? What kind of a man?
Luciano believed in money.
Lucky left, everybody laughed. When he got mad, like a knife, right at you.
He inspired confidence in the other guys that he was the one, that he was the leader.
Lucky Luciano. In the early 1930s, New York City was a mob killing field. Out of this bloody chaos emerged one cold-hearted, brilliant gangster named Lucky Luciano.
It wasn't that he was more violent than the other guys. It wasn't that he was more dangerous. Luciano was able to control his emotions and preserve equanimity when things got hot.
Things were very hot in 1933, especially for Luciano. He had just ordered the execution of one of New York's leading mafiosos, Salvatore Maranzano.
They opened fire on him and they stabbed him with knives. They just made mincemeat out of him, just blew him away.
Mob leaders from around the country wondered who Lucky would kill next. But Lucky surprised them. With his position secure, he set about changing how the mob made its money.
It was prostitution, pornography, of course bootlegging, till that went out of business, and of course the numbers racket, gambling. Those were the principal sources of money, and then later on, of course, narcotics.
Luciano saw big money potential in narcotics, but he knew traditional Sicilian crime families were dead set against the drug business. To convince them, Luciano promised something truly revolutionary. He was going to literally organize crime.
If you can apply the word genius to crime, Lucky Luciano was a genius, because to take this disorganized mass of crooks and build them into a structured organization was a remarkable achievement.
Lucky ordered a sit-down meeting in New York and created a secret commission made up of the leaders of 5 notorious crime families.
Lucky Luciano was the main organizer of the idea of a commission which would resolve disputes among families. The heads of the families would sit in on the commission, would strategize what organized crime was going to be, would set neighborhoods or jurisdictions for the operations of certain families.
Each family had a boss, an underboss, capo regime, a capo di sena, that is the head of a crew or skipper, and then soldiers filled out the crew.
These crime bosses would oversee a national syndicate of big city mobsters, including, at Lucky's insistence, Jewish gangsters Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel.
If they could get along together and make money together, that was the only standard that Luciano had. He didn't care what your nationality was or what your religion was. If I can trust you and we can make money, we'll work together.
The commission had plenty of hitmen who would ensure that profits were shared, disputes settled, and informants rubbed out. There was one chairman of the board, Lucky Luciano.
He avoided the title boss of bosses, but Luciano clearly was the power behind the commission.
Under his control by the mid-1930s, the syndicate was raking in the bucks.
Organized crime families were pulling in as much money as the 10 largest industrial corporations in the United States put together.
The more sophisticated ones got into taking control over various locals, unions, and they also went into various industries, whether it's the carting industry, trucking industry within the garment district, longshoreman industry, concrete work.
As chairman of the commission, Lucky got a piece of all this action. He used some of that money to pay off cops and judges.
Because as you make money in vice-type crime, what comes with it is corruption. And Lucky Luciano and his lieutenants were absolute experts in corrupting the system.
Even newspaper reporters were on Lucky's payroll.
You got to remember that New York City had 9 newspapers. in that era. All the newsmen knew him, and it was a wave and a hello and hiya, Lucky, and so on.
His mad money came from drugs and prostitution. Working girls from New York to Miami helped Luciano to gross an estimated $12 million a year, making him one of New York's leading bachelors.
He lived a very glamorous life, the best nightclubs, the Stork Club, the 21 restaurant, the races. He got around into all the right places, always with a big wad of cash.
He prided himself on the elegance of his clothes. He always had a great, huge white handkerchief just exploding out of his pocket.
He was kind of out of central casting of what the image of a mobster became in the 20s and 30s. But on the other hand, his personality included traits of being very clever, very cunning. He had the ability to attract people and attract loyalty of people.
Especially women. They were drawn to Lucky's money and power.
I used to get a funny feeling whenever Lucky would walk in a room, and when I was real young, I never could understand that. I didn't realize that's how dopey I was. I didn't realize that it was like a sexual attraction.
He has parties, there are lots of women around, but never any serious relationship. I think it says something about his ultimate selfishness and self-involvement. What he was interested in was his career as the biggest gangster in town, and he didn't want any distractions.
Luciano relished playing the role of a dashing businessman, friend of the high society set, a lawbreaker who acted above the law.
It was very dangerous. Lansky always said, they'll nail you for this. This is inviting trouble that you don't need. But he loved being Charlie Lucky Luciano, the #1 gangster in town.
The man who turned the mob into big business was born on November 24, 1897, in the poor Sicilian town of Leccara Fridi. His parents named him Salvatore Lucania. They lived a hard life and dreamed of escaping to the promised land, America. In 1907, when Salvatore was 10, the Lucanias, like many Sicilian families, made that dream come true.
They came to America with the expectation that they would have opportunity, and a lot of them, including Lucky Luciano's family, found themselves in dire circumstances in the Lower East Side of New York, living in cold tenement flats and working very hard just to sustain existence.
Housing was cramped and dirty. Crime raged through the neighborhood. Little Salvatore found the lure of the streets and the money he could make there more appealing than school. By the age of 14, he dropped out and took his first job, delivering hats for $7 a week.
There was always a suspicion that he used that job of delivering hats when he first started fooling around with the sale of illegal drugs, and that he would put some in the hat boxes as a good hiding place and stroll along. There'd be nothing in his pockets incriminating. When he wanted to make a delivery, just reach into the hat box, make the sale, and continue on his way.
Out on the streets, Salvatore began his real education. He watched as local hoodlums ripped off hard-working immigrants who sold food and clothing from pushcarts. It was easy money. Salvatore wanted in.
He by then had committed to a criminal life. He was out there doing small-time crimes, smoking opium, having a sex life of sorts.
To mask his identity, Salvatore took on several different names, including Charles Lucky Luciano. His luck didn't last long. At the age of 18, he was busted for possession of heroin and sentenced to a year in jail. There, he met a host of young hoodlums. Back on the streets, he joined up with the infamous Five Pointers, the toughest and most corrupt street gang in New York.
And the 5 points referred to 5 different areas of New York that came together at a certain place in the Lower East Side. It was really one of the first instances where people came together and formed a criminal syndicate for the purpose of making money.
That money went straight to Tammany Hall. Every election day, Lucky harassed voters to keep the Democratic machine running.
That would enable them to engage in their other criminal activities during the year with a very understanding Tammany Hall, who appointed the police captain in each precinct, who appointed the magistrate that you would be brought before if you should be arrested. So you got protection for all of your illegal activities during the course of the year if you worked for Tammany Hall on Election Day.
Two of his closest associates were Jewish gangsters, the good-looking, violent Benjamin Bugsy Siegel and the short, quiet, intellectual Meyer Lansky. Lansky eventually became Lucky's most loyal partner in crime.
And they got together on the Lower East Side, sometime in their late teens apparently, and became very close friends. A relationship that was so close that Bugsy Siegel, for example, who knew them both well, said that they were more than brothers, they were almost like lovers. Not to suggest that they had sex, but they had that kind of unspoken, intuitive bond. They could finish each other's sentences, or there would be a pause, and then the other one would say what the other was thinking. It was a very close connection, and it's a key to Luciano's rise, because he always has Lansky whispering in his ear.
Another key to his rise, being in the right place, New York, at the right time, the 1920s, the era of Prohibition and bootlegging.
Once Prohibition started, people like Lucky Luciano made fortunes, not only with the typical rackets, the traditional rackets of prostitution, drug running, and gambling. The illegal alcohol was the primary business and the primary moneymaker for organized crime.
Lucky and his friends learned the racket from a master, Arnold Rothstein, the man who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series.
Arnold Rothstein hired Lansky and Luciano, Ben Siegel, Frank Costello, a lot of other people who became famous names in organized crime later on, all went to work originally for Rothstein. He became a financial backer for some of these young men. Okay, you learn the business, now you go out on your own, and I will give you the financial backing and some political protection.
And Lucky Luciano and his lieutenants were absolute experts in corrupting the system to allow illegal liquor, for example, to flourish. And unfortunately in our history, the 20s and 30s were an era where corruption went hand in hand with the activities of Luciano and his people.
By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano was a rising star in the New York mob.
He was of Sicilian birth, Sicilian on both sides of his family, and you needed that in those days to make anywhere in the Mafia. But at the same time, he was more Americanized. He also had much wider contacts than most of the Sicilian gangsters.
It wasn't long before one of the reigning Sicilian dons, Joe the Boss Masseria, snatched up Luciano. Masseria put Lucky in charge of the Italian gangs on the East Side, who were fighting a nasty turf war with his arch rival, another old-time Sicilian don, Salvatore Maranzano.
Your first hero
That's right.
was Salvatore
Maranzano.
Maranzano.
Yes.
One of Luciano's rivals was the late crime boss, Joseph Bonanno.
Joe Bonanno is probably the best example of the Sicilian traditionalists in modern organized crime, as opposed to the Lucky Lucianos, the Frank Costellos, the Joe Adonises, the Meyer Lanskys, who branched out beyond that tradition.
Bonanno described how tough Maranzano was.
But then you say he was said to be able to snap a man's neck with his fingers. And I say when I read that...
That's a metaphorical.
Well, it's quite a metaphor.
Well,
it's quite a metaphor.
You gotta make sure fighting for your life and to protect your life, and nobody has the right to destroy another human being. Or you don't do, but once you do, make sure. And make sure that you protect yourself with anything.
Maranzano tried to persuade Lucky to switch sides and work for him. Luciano turned his back. Bad move.
He was picked up by 4 gangsters, apparently, around 50th Street in New York City. They beat him up terribly. He was bloodied and stabbed and kicked around and left for dead.
Luciano crawled away. He was spotted by a cop who forced him, against his will, into a hospital ward.
In the hospital, he was visited by some of his pals like Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky, and As they were looking at Lucky laying in the hospital bed, Lucky was half dead. He said, "Dag, you're really lucky." He said, "Dag, you're really lucky to be alive." And some guy said, "Yeah, you're so lucky, we're going to start to call you Lucky."
The beating left him with a droopy eyelid and a nasty scar across his chin.
He was pockmarked anyway from smallpox when he was a child. So you looked at him for the first time and it was a nightmare of a face, I can tell you.
The attack left another deep and lasting impression on Luciano. He saw the gang war between the two aging Sicilians as not only pointless, but bad for business. There was only one way to fix this mess.
He took his boss to lunch at a very nice Italian restaurant in Coney Island.
At a certain point, Luciano excuses himself and goes to the men's room, and just at that point, remarkably enough, in come the assassins and kill Joe the boss.
Masseria was dead before the spaghetti turned cold. Luciano now had a new boss, the very man who had tried to kill him, Salvatore Maranzano.
Maranzano was very happy to have these really smart, bright young thugs working for him.
But Lucky hadn't forgotten his treatment by Maranzano, or the outdated ways he did business.
The old school of Sicilian mafia bosses was very formal and had strict codes of behavior and strict forms of even social forms of address and initiation into the mafia. Luciano wasn't interested in any of that stuff. Bucks is what we're after.
In the world of the Sicilian Mafia, there's something even sweeter than money: revenge.
In 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was sitting in his office when his office was invaded by people who posed as internal revenue agents who were actually mobsters, sent there probably by Luciano and Meyer Lansky.
Maranzano was stabbed, then riddled with bullets. By 1933, Lucky Luciano had wiped away the old order, just in time to see the end of Prohibition. He was the New York mob's new boss, respected and feared.
Mafia people are known by the halo of fear that surrounds them. And so if you're known as a hitter, if you're known as somebody who has the force to eliminate your enemies, then you gain in stature and you gain in respect.
Lucky told a story. When Lucky said anything at all, everybody listened. Yeah, Lucky, yeah. Lucky laughed, everybody laughed. It was just wonderful to watch this. Everybody got mad, like a knife, right at you.
By 1935, Charles Lucky Luciano had risen to the top of the Mafia leadership, more powerful than Al Capone, and just as dangerous. He was 37 years old, but as Prohibition ended, the public's infatuation with organized crime began to give way to fear. Something needed to be done.
We have made a real start on cleaning the gangsters out of New York.
In New York, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey was determined to put gangsters like Luciano behind bars.
For 20 years, the underworld has preyed on our people and robbed them, and then frightened them into silence.
Dewey was a crusader, a man with as much ambition and shrewdness as Luciano himself.
He was honest, he was forthright, time meant nothing to him, and his word meant everything to him.
One of Dewey's first targets was a powerful Jewish racketeer from the Bronx, Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a founding member of Luciano's commission, but he was a hothead.
Dutch Schultz became a person obsessed with killing, with violence. And in Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky's world, they used violence only very selectively.
When Schultz threatened to put out a contract on Dewey, Luciano stepped in. He saw that killing Dewey was bad for business. This required an executive decision. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz was paid a visit by the Commission Security Force, alias Murder Incorporated.
The overwhelming evidence and intelligence information suggests that Lucky Luciano and his people, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky, all knew and approved of that hit.
But if Luciano was doing him a favor, Thomas Dewey didn't bother to thank him. He wanted Lucky and the vice he was peddling off the streets.
He became a lightning rod for law enforcement. He became someone to depose as a crime boss to show the effectiveness of law enforcement against organized crime.
Dewey began to build a drug case against Luciano, but pinning a narcotics charge on Lucky proved difficult, so Dewey aimed low. He singled out one of Lucky's underbosses, a gangster named Little Davy Patillo. He ran Luciano's multi-million-dollar prostitution racket, and he liked to brag about his boss.
And so to get the prostitution people to do what he wanted them to do, Patillo would say, well, Lucky's in on this too.
Now, the way things operate in their real world, if Charlie Luciano has given you the authority to operate what is now becoming a very, very lucrative business, you'd be very foolish to say, well, good, and all the money and the profit belongs to me. You'd be crazy to do that. What you should do is once a month you call up Charlie and say, Charlie, in appreciation for all you've done for me, this is for you. And when Charlie accepts that envelope full of cash, he is obtaining the fruits of prostitution.
Dewey figured that a prostitution rap would humiliate a major crime boss like Luciano.
For a big-time mobster like Lucky Luciano to be convicted of prostitution is a slap in the face. It is an embarrassment because it's really considered a low-level and kind of a dirty business.
When word leaked of an investigation, Lucky left town. Dewey began to build his case. He found 3 chambermaids at the Waldorf Astoria who were willing to testify that Davy Patillo's pimps had met with Luciano. Dewey arrested several of Lucky's prostitutes and gave them a choice: 7 years in jail or testimony. In March of 1936, Luciano was tracked down and arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Dewey slapped him with a 62-count indictment for compulsory prostitution. The vice trial put the dashing Luciano in a tawdry negative light. The press and the public turned against him. One by one, the witnesses, forced to wear disguises, laid out the case against Lucky. Finally, Luciano took the stand. Dewey grilled him, called him a liar and a cheat. For the first time in his life, Lucky was cornered. It took the jury less than 24 hours to find Luciano guilty. His sentence was a whopping 30 to 50 years.
It was a bombshell. It had tremendous impact politically, socially, and economically on organized crime and on the people of the city of New York.
If Lucky Luciano, the most powerful racketeer of them all, could be sent off to prison and labeled the king of the pimps, then maybe the mob was not invincible after all. Luciano's partners in crime left New York. Meyer Lansky moved to Florida and Havana, where he could oversee the mob's gambling interests. Bugsy Siegel chose Hollywood, where he could expand the rackets on the West Coast. Some old-line Mafia families figured Lucky had gotten his comeuppance.
I take it that what you're saying is, if you are a man of honor, if you are a man of tradition, Luciano was not.
That's right.
But life in Dannemora prison wasn't all that bad for Luciano, who, despite his conviction, was still chairman of the mob.
Luciano spends his time playing gin rummy, hanging around the yard. Little Davy Patillo is in jail with him and does all his cooking for him, prepares his meals for him. Someone else does Luciano's jobs at the prison. He gets his pants pressed and his shirts pressed. And it's just a sign of his underworld reputation.
By 1942, Lucky Luciano had been languishing behind bars for 6 long years. Yesterday's news to a country focused on more serious issues: World War II. Lucky's old city, New York, was on edge. More than 120 merchant ships had been sunk off the coast by German subs. Nazi spies were spotted on New York's West Side piers, which were still run by Luciano. Then in February, just days before she set sail, a mysterious fire gutted the Normandy, a luxury liner the Navy had been converting to a troop carrier. The Germans took the credit, but rumors swirled around the docks that Lucky Luciano's thugs had the ship torched, all in an effort to destabilize the coastline and force the administration to bend its knee to Luciano. If the story is true, it apparently worked.
Naval intelligence officers had to seek out Lucky Luciano while he was serving a prison term to ask him that he should make sure there would be no espionage, there would be no sabotage, and there would be no strikes.
Luciano did not go along with it at first. My inference is that Luciano was still mad at the law, with reason. Lansky talked him into it, said it would be a good thing for the mob to be seen in this patriotic role. And so Luciano gave his permission.
To some officials, Luciano's work with naval intelligence, dubbed Operation Underworld, was proof of his considerable influence. They saw mob-controlled fishermen and longshoremen working hand in hand to ferret out German spies.
It was kind of novel. I think, gee, we can have the mob protecting the country. Isn't that wonderful?
But to the FBI, there was nothing wonderful about Lucky's patriotic story. In these recently released files, FBI investigators concluded that records, quote, failed to indicate that Luciano had ever furnished assistance or information to the Navy. The files also reveal that New York's Naval Intelligence Commander, Charles Red Haffenden, was a golfing buddy of Frank Costello, Lucky's business partner in crime. Suspicions remain about the amount of good Lucky did for his country. On the other hand,
it was good for Lucky Luciano because the strategy of the mob is they don't give up anything for nothing. So if they're going to do something for you, they want something in return. And the thing that Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano and his cohorts wanted worse than anything was to spring Luciano from prison. And so the strategy was to help the government to do what you could to do your, quote, patriotic duty, but with an eye on asking favors later.
They picked up one favor right away. Lucky was transferred to a minimum security prison a few hours from the city, Great Meadow. One by one, Lansky and Costello came to see Lucky.
If your business is important enough, you're going to have henchmen who will come up and see you, and they'll speak in the code language.
They were pulling strings, working the system. In 1943, Commander Haffenden wrote a letter to the New York State Parole Board on Lucky's behalf. He mentioned Lucky's patriotic work on the docks and even floated a news story, this one about Lucky's role in the Allied invasion of Sicily.
All the Mafia bosses had been alerted by Lucky Luciano that they should be friendly to the Allied forces, to the British and Americans, and should help to facilitate the landings in every way possible.
Again, the FBI found no evidence to support Lucky's story. Regardless, by the time Lucky's parole hearing came up in 1946, he had convinced, some said paid off, all the people necessary to spring him from jail. All except one.
And strangely enough, the same gentleman who prosecuted him, Thomas Dewey, is now the governor of the state of New York, who would have to sign the papers to release him from jail.
But there was a catch. Lucky had never applied for U.S. citizenship, so Dewey had him deported back to Italy. On February 10, 1946, Luciano sailed out of New York Harbor. To ease the pain, Lucky's old friends in the mob gave him a sweet going-away present.
All the bosses contributed some money to a big, fat envelope of cash. Just before the ship got underway, they handed him this gigantic envelope, which had about $300,000 or $400,000 in it. He felt very good about that.
Weeks later, Lucky Luciano set foot on Italian soil for the first time since childhood. Waiting for him at the dock in Naples were the Italian police. They questioned him briefly, then set him free. It didn't take Luciano long to get back in the game. He quickly took control of the international heroin trade.
He somehow cornered the market and then found a way to get the heroin processed in laboratories and factories in central Italy. And then he found a pipeline to get the stuff to New York.
That pipeline led through Cuba, a mafia paradise. After 8 months in Italy, Luciano defied his deportation orders and fled to Havana.
The plan was always to get Lucky back somehow into the United States sphere of influence, so to speak. And while it became impossible for him to come back to the United States, I think Meyer Lansky and others persuaded the Cuban authorities to let Lucky Luciano come back to Havana, to live there.
It was a totally corrupt society run by a dictator who was taking money and bribes from American gangsters to run the casinos there. So it was seen as an open town, Havana, for the mob, so Luciano probably thought he'd be safe there.
Safe enough to call a summit meeting. In April 1947, Lucky called together his old commission pals, Meyer Lansky, Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino, and Frank Costello. There was one more guest. He was singing in the hotel ballroom.
The excuse for the meeting was to celebrate Frank Sinatra and listen to his songs, but he was just a front. And during that meeting, they laid down a law on such things as the heroin route from Sicily to Cuba, and then from Cuba to the mainland of the United States. And Luciano was the chairman of the board at that meeting.
Other issues were on Lucky's agenda. The division of profits from Cuban casinos, and what to do about his childhood friend, Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy had been careless with mob money and had lost millions of dollars building the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas.
They sort of held a kangaroo court there and decided what are they going to do about Bugsy. And Lucky said, you got to kill him. That sealed Bugsy Siegel's fate.
Word of Luciano's reemergence in Cuba traveled back to Washington and the newly formed U.S. Bureau of Narcotics. They sent out a special agent, Harry Anslinger, to Havana to check out Luciano's operation. He saw plenty to worry about.
He said that Luciano was going to be using Havana as a pumping station for illegal heroin into the United States.
Mr. Anslinger was so intense and strong against Luciano that he actually persuaded then-President Harry Truman to make threats against the Cuban government by threatening sanctions against Cuba if they allowed Lucky Luciano to remain. The Cubans saw that as a reality and ultimately deported Lucky Luciano back to Italy. While making money is a primary function of organized crime, and it's what every crime boss tries to do, the fact of the matter is, I think that money is secondary to the amount of power that you have within the organized criminal group and the perception of the public.
Tell that to Lucky Luciano. By 1947, he had been deported from the United States, kicked out of Cuba, bounced back to Rome, then sent packing to Naples. To the New York families, Lucky was gone and seemingly forgotten, despite a monthly bag of cash, courtesy of Meyer Lansky.
Lucky Luciano became disenchanted and very despondent over the fact that $25,000 a month was not a sufficient sum for a person of his prestige, considering all the money that his friends were making in the United States.
He was miserable. He used to say, if they would just give me a week in New York and a week in Miami, and I could die happy. but he was never allowed home.
However, the Italian paparazzi tried to make Lucky feel right at home. They were glad to have a real New York gangster in their midst. Well-dressed and cosmopolitan, Lucky played right into their hands.
He had charisma. He had charisma, yes, he did. And it didn't come from the watch he had, where the hours were marked by authentic diamonds. Little diamonds, real diamonds. And you could tell they were real. And it wasn't just the way he dressed, because, surprisingly, he was a true gentleman. He was larger than life. He had the physique du rôle, the look that could be attributed to a leading actor, to the leading actor, because when he walked in, he attracted attention.
It was his movie star charisma that attracted a stunning Italian woman, some 20 years his junior, named Agia Lissoni.
A very lovely girl. She took to Lucky Luciano. They used to call him Looky over there, L-O-O-K-Y. Not being able to pronounce the word lucky. And she took to Lucky Luciano in a big way. And I think he really did find the love of his life. And they were very, very happy together.
Lucky and his mistress settled into a luxurious penthouse in Naples on Via Tasso with a breathtaking view of the city. The former boss of bosses was mellowing with age. He developed a reputation for generosity, offering to help Neapolitans in need.
In the morning when I used to come here, I would see 7, 8 people waiting for Lucky Luciano outside the restaurant, and these people would say to him, "Mr. Lucky, Mr. Luciano, my husband is unemployed." To some, Mr. Luciano gave 30,000 liras, to some 20,000. In some cases, he would pay for a doctor to visit sick people at home. It's incredible how much good this man did.
The homesick Luciano seldom passed up a chance to mingle with American tourists.
I'm sitting in Naples with my wife. Lucky Luciano comes over. He introduced his dog. Dog's name was Bambi. I said, "Bambi? After Disney film?" He says, "Yeah, I like fairy tales." I says, "What can I do for you, Lucky?" He says, "I want to hear New York talk." New York talk? Yeah. So we talk New York. I have a New York accent. And he missed it.
Still, by 1949, Lucky had plenty of action. Drug agents in the United States were tracking a huge increase in the flow of narcotics from Europe. Their prime suspect was Luciano.
He became the target of many, many investigations, particularly by the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and narcotics enforcement people in Europe. Harry Anslinger dispatched a top narcotics agent to Italy who conducted year-long investigations of Luciano, tracked his activity, put him under surveillance. He never really made a case against Lucky Luciano. Lucky was too smart and too elusive.
The Italian police were taking no chances. They had Luciano deported again, this time to Sicily.
And I'm sure he was very, very distressed to find himself back in Sicily and having to start that cycle all over again.
It didn't take him long to regroup. Lucky set up a candy factory in Palermo, making what Italians call confetti, sugar-coated almonds served at weddings. It looked like a legitimate business, but the cops weren't so sweet on the idea.
He hired some trucks to take the shipment down to a freighter, very proud of himself. But the police were there in force, and they opened up all the boxes of confetti, and they smashed with hammers all the almonds looking for heroin. They didn't find one drop of heroin, one speck of it, and they completely ruined this whole confetti operation.
Lucky was both determined and creative. He staged a fake charity auction of ceramic dolls. Packed inside the dolls was high-grade heroin.
When we met, he obviously realized that I had no idea about those dolls, and he labeled me a classic fool. He said, "You are a moron," and he took pleasure in calling me a genuine moron because I had not realized that inside the dolls there was the java. Jobba is a job, I understand.
The Jabba, of course, was Lucky's real job, drug trafficking. He kept it up over the next few years. Then, in 1958, Luciano's luck began to change. Igia, his girlfriend of 9 years and the love of his life, died of cancer. It was a devastating loss.
After her death, he didn't want to talk about her anymore because he suffered when he talked about her. The only woman he loved in his life was Igia, in the real sense of love and affection.
His relationship with the American mob grew strained. The other bosses felt he was grabbing more than his share of profits from the heroin business. The checks he received from the U.S. syndicate got smaller and smaller. Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba ended the mob's influence there and closed down Lucky's heroin supply route. Even his health was deteriorating. In 1961, Luciano was hospitalized with a heart ailment. He recovered, but with no wife or family, he was a shell of his former self. He was left with his money and memories. On the morning of January 26, 1962, Lucky stopped in at his favorite restaurant to place an order for lunch.
It was around 11 o'clock when he came in and asked for salt cod Sicilian style. And the maitre d' said, "Okay." He said, "I'll be back at 1:30. I'm just going to Capodichino Airport to pick up someone."
Lucky Luciano never made it back. He died of a massive heart attack. He was 64 years old. Luciano's funeral was a majestic procession through Naples. Mourners lined the streets. In death, his wish to come home to America had been granted. Lucky Luciano, the man who built the mob into a multi-billion-dollar business, was quietly buried in a Catholic cemetery in Queens, New York.
Lucky Luciano really can be known and can be famous for the fact that he was the bridge between the old-type mafia, the conservatives, and the new syndicate people who can be called the liberals.
He structured the La Cosa Nostra as it has continued to this very day. You could not have a good understanding of the history of organized crime in the United States without having studied Charles Lucky Luciano.